In this lesson, we are going to set the stage for our exploration of the early years of the United States, specifically from 1775 to 1789. During this period, significant events unfolded that shaped the foundation of our nation. I will guide you through these pivotal moments, highlighting the transition from colonial rule to the establishment of a republic, making sure that we define specifically what a republic is and is not. Once again, as I indicated, we always start with our learning objectives. We will delve into the government structure established by the Articles of Confederation, examining its implementation and the reasons behind its eventual failure. Additionally, we will explore how the Constitution redefined the nation's governance and the widespread objections it faced from various segments of the American population. So let's consider the nature of government created under the Articles of Confederation. It was characterized by a weak central authority, meaning there was no president, which ultimately struggled to address the needs of the new nation. Understanding this context is crucial as we analyze the subsequent developments in American governance. The limitations of taxation under the Articles of Confederation are highlighted in this slide. The Continental Congress established a framework that required unanimous consent for significant decisions, which hampered effective governance. The lack of a centralized authority to enforce tax collection led to financial difficulties, impacting trade and essential services. Remember that coming out of the American Revolution, the colonies were significantly in debt. After declaring independence, the Continental Congress turned its attention to a written document specifying its powers and its authority on which it was grounded. Congressmen reached an agreement on the Articles of Confederation defining the Union as a loose confederation of states. The structure of the Confederation government did not provide for a national executive, as I pointed out, and it did not provide for a judiciary. The Congress was the sole governing agency. Routine decisions in the Congress required a simple majority of 7 states. For monumentous decisions, such as declaring war, a two-thirds majority of 9 states was needed to agree. And to approve or amend changing the articles, it required unanimous consent. How often do we get unanimous consent on everything? Think about going on a vacation and trying to get everyone to agree on what excursions you will take. Taxation was a necessity for the new government. As I indicated, there were hefty and immediate war costs that had been financed mostly by Congress-issued bonds, held in part by French and Dutch bankers, but also by middling to wealthy Americans. Trade regulation required a paid force of custom officers, a postal system required postmen, horses and wagons and well-maintained roads for the post office. The Western lands required surveyors, and Native American diplomacy or war added further large costs. The article specified that state tax contributions were to be assessed in proportion to the property value of the state's land, so that large and populous states paid more than small or sparsely populated states. However, there was no mechanism in place to compel the states to pay their fair share. The lack of a centralized authority in the Confederation government was exactly what many state leaders wanted in the late 1770s. After all, they had just relieved themselves from what they considered to be a tyrannical ruler, and a parliament that excluded their participation in their own affairs. Laid out on this slide is the structural weaknesses that were inherent in the Articles of Confederation. The inability of Congress to collect taxes or regulate commerce created significant challenges. The absence of a separate executive branch, which will continue to emphasize, and a national court system further complicated the government, leading to a system that was more of a loose alliance than a functional government. So, what kind of government did the Articles of Confederation create? And secondly, how did a weak government wage war? Well, there was no fanfare that greeted the long delayed inauguration of the new government. State legislatures were slow to select delegates to go to Congress, and appointees were often reluctant to attend. Also, many politicians preferred to serve in state governments rather than in a centralized government. To address the difficulties of an inefficient Congress, executive departments of war, finance, and foreign affairs were created to handle purely administrative functions. In the United States, there are 4 states that are officially designated as commonwealths. These states include Kentucky, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And this is a holdover from the Articles of Confederation, where the term Commonwealth was used in their full official state names and appears in documents like their state constitution. It's important to note that the states were considered to be more important than a centralized national government, which didn't exist. And the status of commonwealths is indicative of this sentiment that was held by the 4 states that I just identified. We now turn to the implementation of the Republican government. This concept was rooted in the belief that power should reside with the citizens, exercised through their elected representatives. Understanding how these ideals were put into practice will provide insight into the evolution of American democracy. But before we proceed, I thought it prudent to define what a Republican government is. In our last election cycle, we heard many people disclaiming this notion of a democracy, and that we do not have a democracy but a republic. Well, a republic is one that is governed by the people, by the consent of the governed, through democratic practices such as elections. And it's really important that we make that distinction and we clarify this notion of what a republic is, or what the American Republic is. So that said, it's important that we understand that republicanism is a central theme in this slide. It emphasizes the belief in citizen sovereignty. The qualities of civic virtue are essential for the functioning of the republic as they encourage active participation and responsibility amongst citizens. This commitment to the public good was so strong that some states identified, as I previously indicated, as commonwealths. And so when we talk about republicanism and we talk about civic virtue, we identify qualities that citizens must possess, such as being conscientious, making sure that you show up to participate when there are elections, that you're actively engaged in the civic events that occur within your location, that you're responsible, you show up to vote, and that you're patriotic, that you have a commitment to our country and our national identity. Sentiment of civic virtue is so strong that, as I indicated, that those four states called themselves commonwealths because they believe in these civic virtues that I just articulated. In May of 1776, Congress encouraged states to draft their constitutions reflecting Republican ideals, those things that I just talked about. Most states adopted a bicameral legislature with a lower house designed to be responsive to the people, the populace, and the inclusion of bills of rights in several states' constitutions marked a significant step towards protecting individual liberties. In May of 1776, the Congress, as I indicated, recommended that all states draw up constitutions based on the authority of the people. A shared feature of all state constitutions, again, was that they included the Bill of Rights. There was a conviction that the government ultimately rests on the consent of the governed. Nearly every state continued the colonial practice of a two-chamber assembly, but greatly augmented the powers of the lower house. Most states eventually limited the term and powers of the government. And so one of the things that we should note at this point, since we should also take note of the current structure of governance here in Georgia, is the fact that we have a two-house legislature that includes an assembly and a senate. In other words, we have assemblymen and state senators here in Georgia. In 6 state constitutions, there was the inclusion of Bill of Rights, which were lists of basic individual liberties that governments could not abridge. In other words, the Congress at this time under the Articles of Confederation encouraged the development of these state constitutions, which are hallmarks of our system of governance. Remember that in every state, all 50 states, each one of the states has a constitution. How was Republican government implemented? Who were the people? Government officials had to define who met the requirements for citizenship and how far the principle of democratic government extended. Property, believe it or not, constituted the first important limit, with nearly every state imposing property qualifications on voters and political candidates. In other words, you had to own property. Property qualifications disenfranchised 1/4 to 1/2 of adult white males, not all of whom accepted the prevailing opinion that only property owners possess the independence necessary to make wise political choices. Another exclusion from voting was gender. It was so ingrained that very few thought to question it. So powerful was the unspoken assumption that only men could vote. Only 3 states had bothered to specify that voters had to be male. Questions existed over whether women and free Black people who met property qualifications should be allowed to vote. And believe it or not, New Jersey enfranchised property owning women and free Black people. So New Jersey in 1776 and thereafter was the only state in the United States that allowed free Black people and women to participate in voting in their states. There was a complex relationship between the new state governments and the institution of slavery. While some states began to challenge slavery, others resisted change. The gradual emancipation laws in the North contrasted sharply with the deep-rooted practices in the South, highlighting the tensions surrounding civil rights and property rights. So, how was Republican government implemented, and how did these new governments confront the institution of slavery. The various state bills of rights, egalitarian proclamations of natural freedoms for all, cast a new harsh light on the morality and legitimacy of slavery, threatening to destabilize the institution. Northern enslaved Black people challenged their bondage by petitioning state legislatures for freedom by suing in court. Several enslaved Black people in Massachusetts won their freedom in the courts in the 1780s, and by 1789, slavery had been effectively abolished by judicial decisions in the state. Pennsylvania ended slavery by issuing a statute in 1780 providing for gradual emancipation. Emancipation means freedom. The state fully abolished slavery in 1847. Those who were enslaved in Pennsylvania did not always wait for legal emancipation, but ran away from their owners and claimed freedom. By 1790, free Black people outnumbered slaves in Pennsylvania 2-1. Rhode Island and Connecticut adopted gradual emancipation laws in 1784. New York followed suit in 1799, as did New Jersey in 1804. Republican governments protected people's rights to both liberty and property, yet enslaved Black people were both people and property, which is going to pose a challenge during the Constitutional Convention. Gradual emancipation attempted to balance the civil rights of enslaved Black people and the property rights of their owners. Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, where slavery was more central to the economy, rejected emancipation bills but allowed individual acts of emancipation under new manumission laws. By 1790, around 10,000 newly freed Virginia slaves lived in free Black communities. In the Deep South, freedom for enslaved peoples was unthinkable. Yet several thousand had defected to the British during the war and afterwards departed the United States, as I indicated in the last presentation. Small groups, gradual and incomplete, these emancipations had enormous symbolic significance. We're going to go ahead and identify some of the key factors that contributed to the failure of the Articles of Confederation, which should be clear at this point, lacking a strong centralized government. Understanding these causes is essential for grasping the motivations behind the drafting of the Constitution and the desire for a more robust federal government. And as I started saying, some of these things should be obvious by this point. A lack of a strong central government, a lack of a central or unitary leader, the lack of the ability to raise and collect taxes, the lack of ability to raise an army. So what exactly were the causes for the things that led to the calling of a constitutional convention? Shays' Rebellion serves as a critical example of the unrest that arose under the Articles of Confederation. The rebellion highlighted the weaknesses of the government and growing discontent amongst citizens, particularly farmers facing economic hardship. This event underscored the urgent need for reform. So how did the Confederation government financial constraints boil to a crisis? Well, in 1785, the government requested $3 million from the states, an amount 4 times greater than the previous year, in order to pay for government operating costs, to repay debts to foreign lenders, and to reimburse American bondholders However, the states were no more solvent than the Confederation government. In other words, the states didn't have any money either. The 1785 requisition sparked crowd protests, demands for paper money, and an anger at state authorities and speculators in nearly every state. Some states ignored the requisition, while others in town meetings voted to refuse it. Massachusetts, however, wanting to retire its state debt by raising taxes and insisting that they be paid in hard money, loaded the federal requisition onto an existing tax bill. Farmers in Massachusetts petitioned against the oppressive taxation, and when they were ignored, called for revisions to the state constitution. Still unheard, the dissidents targeted the most visible symbol of state authority in their regions, the county courthouses, forcing them to close their doors. The governor of Massachusetts, who had once organized protests against British taxes, now characterized the Western dissidents as illegal rebels and vilified the chief leader, Daniel Shays. Members of the Continental Congress grew worried that the situation in Massachusetts was spinning out of control, so they attempted to bolster the federal army with new recruits. Governor Bowdoin raised a private army of some 3,000 soldiers paid by wealthy Boston merchants. The insurgents failed to capture a federal armory in Springfield, and after a few encounters, the rebellion was defeated. Only 2 men were executed and 4,000 gained leniency by confessing their misconduct and swearing an oath of allegiance. Shays' rebellion caused leaders throughout the country to worry about the Confederation's ability to keep the nation from disintegrating. Legislatures passed the heaviest direct tax ever. The tax was to be paid in specie, which means gold or silver coin, rather than in paper money, because gold and silver were worth something and retained their value. Specie was far more scarce and much more. David Shays, as I indicated, was a war veteran who now found himself facing jail for his debts. In 1786, he led a rebellion that quickly spread through the local area. And this is just some more background information on David Shays and his role in Shays' rebellion. We're going to go ahead and summarize the transformative changes brought about by the Constitution. It replaced the Articles of Confederation with a stronger federal framework, addressing many of the weaknesses that had previously hindered the government. The events leading to the Constitutional Convention were driven by a desire to address trade regulation issues. The gathering in Philadelphia in 1787 aimed to revise the Articles of Confederation. And let me repeat that. The purpose of the convention in Philadelphia in 1777 was not to write a new constitution, but to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, ultimately, it resulted in the creation of a new governing document. So one of the questions that we might ask is, how did the Constitution change the nation's form of government, and what events led to a new constitutional convention? A group of Virginians led by James Madison convinced the Congress to allow a meeting of delegates at Annapolis, Maryland in the fall of 1786 to try to again, to revise the trade regulation powers spelled out in the Articles of Confederation. Delegates from only 5 states showed up, and they planned a second meeting in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Congress reluctantly endorsed the Philadelphia meeting and tried to limit its scope to revising the articles, as I just mentioned. The 55 men who assembled in Philadelphia were generally wealthy white men, primarily lawyers, who had served in the Confederation Congress and knew its strengths and weaknesses. During the Constitutional Convention, delegates faced significant challenges in reaching consensus. One of the plans that was suggested was the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, which represented competing visions for the new government. And the Great Compromise was crucial in balancing the interests of both large and small states. So, what exactly was this Virginia Plan and this New Jersey Plan? Well, you should know that the convention worked in secrecy so that the men could freely explore ideas without concern for public opinion. The Virginia delegation first laid out a 15-point plan, the Virginia Plan. The plan repudiated the principle of a confederation of states, sharply reducing the power of smaller states by linking representation to population. So, of course, the Virginia Plan would benefit larger states. In mid-June, delegates from small states unveiled an alternative proposal, the New Jersey Plan, which echoed many of the features from the articles, but departed from them significantly by giving sweeping taxation and the election of a plural presidency held by 3 men. For 2 weeks, the delegates debated the 2 plans, focusing in on the key issue of representation until they were able to reach what is known as the Great Compromise, which produced the basic structural features of the emerging U.S. Constitution. A bicameral legislature, and I'm going to say that again, it created a bicameral legislature which population determined representation in the lower house, the House of Representatives, and equal representation in the upper house, the Senate, which we call the Congress. Representation by population turned out to be an ambiguous concept, particularly in regards to slavery. What emerged was a compromise known as the 3/5 clause. All free persons plus 3/5 of all other persons, meaning slaves, would constitute the numerical base for the apportionment of the representatives. Using the phrase all other persons as a substitute for slaves indicates the discomfort delegates felt in acknowledging the existence of slavery in the Constitution. Slavery was nowhere named, but it was recognized, protected, and thereby perpetuated by the Constitution. And I'm going to spend a few minutes just providing further clarity on these 2 plans to make sure that we're all on the same page. Virginia was a large state, New Jersey was a small state. As you recall, under the Articles of Confederation, taxation was based on the size of a state, meaning large states paid more in taxes while small states did not. Well, as the Constitutional Convention attempted to create a framework for the structure of our government, there was some debate, concerns over the power of small states versus large states, and vice versa. And the compromise that emerged led to, as I indicated, a bicameral legislature. Bicameral meaning 2 houses within the Congress, an upper house, a lower house. In the United States, our federal government has an upper house, which we call the Senate, and a lower house, which we call the House of Representatives. Representation in the Senate is equal across all states, meaning that every state sends 2 senators to Congress. Two, each having the same amount of power as the other. So in our United States Senate, we have 100 senators. In the House of Representatives, every state's representation is based on population, meaning the number of people who live within a state. A certain number of delegates are apportioned to each state based on population. Now, as the country grew, there was a realization that if we continue to grow, the states or the House of Representatives would become so large that it would no longer function. So at some point in our history, Congress capped the size of the House of Representatives to 435 members. Every 10 years, there's a census that is conducted, and the census represents a counting of the American population. And based on that counting of the American population every 10 years, the House of Representatives is reapportioned, meaning there's a determination made whether or not states gain people and other states lost people. If a state lost people, the number of members that they sent to the House of Representatives might decrease. If a state gained people population, the number of members sent to the House of Representatives might increase. So every 10 years, we go through this reapportionment of the House where some states lose and some states gain. Over the last 20 years, we've seen through the census an increase in the population sizes in the South. Because what has happened over the last 20 years is that there's been a migration from northern states into southern states, which has caused southern states to gain greater representation in the House of Representatives. The 3/5 compromise represents this discomfort amongst the delegates in terms of how they would count slaves. The northern states or the large states argued that Southerners had always argued that slaves were property. Therefore, they should not be counted as a part of the population. The southern states countered that they should be counted because they are people for the purpose of representation in the House. And the compromise that was developed was that for every 5 slaves, 3 would be counted for the purpose of representation in Congress. I hope that that is clear because you will see questions related to this on the upcoming quiz, or not the quiz, the tests. The constitutional limit and balance of power. And this is really important, especially as we look at what's happening today in our government. This slide highlights the delegates' intent to limit and balance political power within the new Constitution. By distinguishing between democracy and republicanism, they aim to create a system that they would prevent the tyranny of the majority while ensuring representation. So, how did the Constitution change the nation's government, and how did the Constitution limit the balance of political power? The delegates in Philadelphia made a distinction between democracy and republicanism, terms that were new to the American political vocabulary. The delegates still remained committed to a Republican government, but they created a government that would check the people's voice through a variety of mechanisms. Only representatives in the House were elected by the people directly. Senators up until 1913 were elected by state legislatures and served for 6 years, shielding them from the will of Democratic majorities. Similarly, the presidency evolved into a powerful office out of the reach of direct democracy through the establishment of an electoral college that selected the president and vice president. In other words, the Senate and the president in the early Constitution were not directly elected by the people. Senators' direct election by the people started in 1913 through the passage of the 16th Amendment, and we still have a system wherein the president is elected by an electoral college and not directly by the people. Judges who would serve on the new federal judiciary were appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and thus never subject to election in any form. However, I think it's really important that at this juncture we note, given the vitriol that we currently hear that judges are not elected, they may not be directly elected. However, as a result of the framework of the Constitution, judges are nominated by the President of the United States and are confirmed for life-term appointments at the federal level by the Senate. So indirectly, judges are elected through the elected representatives of the people. I should also note that while senators initially in the Constitution were not directly elected by the people, they were elected by their state legislatures who were elected by the people. So indirectly, in the early days of our Constitution, senators were indirectly elected by the people. And today, our federal judges are indirectly elected by the people through their representatives and the President of the United States. And that was a way in which the framers of the Constitution elected to curb the excesses of democracy. They devised a government with limits and checks on all branches of government. The convention carefully listed the powers of Congress and the president. While no one was entirely satisfied with every line, only 3 delegates refused to sign the Constitution of the United States. We will now explore the reasons behind the widespread objections to the Constitution. There's a video that you should watch at this juncture and then perhaps come back to this video, or you might want to go ahead and listen to this part of the presentation and then go back and look at the video and finish up the presentation. Many Americans were concerned about the potential for centralized power to infringe upon the people, upon individual liberties and the lack of a Bill of Rights. So 2 groups emerged out of the Constitutional Convention focused on the ratification of the Constitution. One group were the Federalists, which favored a strong national government. They favored the proposed Constitution and represented well-educated people in the nation at the time. The other group were the anti-federalists who favored states' rights, opposed strong national governments, and represented farmers and opposed the Constitution. One of the things that I should note at this point is that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are not political parties. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were simply at this time in 1789 those who were in favor of the ratification of the Constitution and those who were not. This slide contrasts the perspectives of Federalists and Anti-Federalists during the ratification debate. Federalists advocated for the Constitution while Anti-Federalists raised concerns about the concentration of power and the absence of protections for individual rights. So who were the Federalists and what did they believe? Well, proponents of the Constitution secured an agreement from the Confederation Congress to defer a vote and instead send the Constitution to the states for their consideration. To gain momentum, the Federalists began the voting in states most likely to support the Constitution before the Anti-Federalists had even begun their campaign. The Federalists had achieved ratification in Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Maryland, and South Carolina. Massachusetts was the first state to seriously challenge the Federalists, but in the end, the Federalists won by a very slim margin in Massachusetts, promising that the first Congress would consider a set of constitutional amendments based on the anti-Federalist objections. By May of 1788, the Federalists had secured ratification in 8 states. Only one more state was needed for the Constitution to come into effect. The greatest cause for concern, however, was their failure to win over the large and economically critical states of Virginia and New York. So why did so many Americans object to this Constitution? Who were the Anti-Federalists, and what did they believe? The Anti-Federalists was a broad coalition of groups united in their objection to the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists' position rested on the fear that distant power would infringe on people's liberties. In the proposed House of Representatives, the only direct democratic element of the Constitution, each member represented some 30,000 people. Federalists generally agreed that national elections would favor the elites. Indeed, it was one of the Constitution's objectives, designed to keep fools and knaves out of governance. The most widespread objection to the Constitution focused on the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights. As I indicated earlier, 6 states had adopted constitutions with bills of rights included. In the end, it was a small state, New Hampshire, that provided the decisive 9th vote to ratify the Constitution on June 21st, 1788, following an intensive and successful lobbying effort by the Federalists. Although the Anti-Federalists lost their struggle to defeat the Constitution, they won in other ways. Most concretely, in the first 10 amendments to it, known as the Bill of Rights. On a more abstract level, the vigorous public debate that they waged expanded the scope of political life, and their arguments against the power of elites brought a robust populist language to the center of American politics. And as I just indicated, the Federalists ultimately triumphed in the ratification debate, despite initial resistance from several states. The publication of the Federalist Papers played a crucial role in the shaping of public opinion and addressing concerns about the new Constitution. So why exactly did the Federalists win the debate? Well, 4 states still remained outside the new union, with New York being the most critical. New York voters leaned anti-Federalist, but the state was home to some of the most brilliant and persuasive Federalist leaders, which included Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who composed and published 85 essays on the political philosophy of the new Constitution, later republished as the Federalist Papers. At New York's ratifying convention, impassioned debate and lobbying, plus the dramatic news of Virginia's ratification, finally tipped the balance to the Federalists. It took another year and a half for anti-Federalists in North Carolina to assent to ratification. In less than 12 months, the U.S. Constitution was both written and ratified. And that concludes my presentation on the new government, the new republic that emerges out of the American Revolution. Next, we will take a look at the birth of a new nation and how that nation will survive based on our first president, George Washington. See you next time. Bye bye.